William Howard Taft ate a 12-ounce beefsteak most mornings before he reached his desk. Not as a reward, not on a special occasion, as a regular weekday breakfast. The 27th President of the United States carried well over 300 pounds on his frame, and the White House kitchen fed every single one of them. Number 20 on this list was carved from the skull of a calf and served on fine china. Number 6 sat on a formal dinner plate and looked exactly like what it was. And number 1 was served to a sitting president at a public banquet while the entire country watched. Hit subscribe, because what this man put on his plate rewrites what the word excess means. Here are 25 grotesque foods President Taft devoured until he passed 300 pounds. Number 25, 12-ounce breakfast beefsteak. Most Americans in the early 1900s started their morning with oatmeal or bread. William Howard Taft started his with a cut of beef heavy enough to be someone else's dinner. A thick beefsteak sat on his breakfast plate nearly every morning, cooked through and served alongside eggs, toast, and black coffee. This was not a weekend indulgence or a holiday tradition. It was daily, as routine as brushing his teeth. By the time Taft entered the White House in 1909, his morning routine alone put more red meat on his plate before 9 o'clock than most working families saw in an entire day. The kitchen staff prepared it without being asked, because it was never not expected. The steak was always finished, the plate was always clean, and lunch was never more than a few hours behind it. Number 24, buttered toast by the platter. Alongside that beefsteak, Taft consumed bread and butter at a pace that turned a side dish into a meal of its own. Thick slices of white bread, toasted and spread heavy with butter, arrived at the breakfast table in rounds. When one serving vanished, another replaced it. Butter in the early 20th century came rich and dense, and it showed up at every course of every meal Taft sat down to. He treated it less like a condiment and more like a food group. For a man already working through a 12-ounce steak before 9 in the morning, the sheer volume of bread and fat beside it was not an accompaniment. It was a second breakfast hiding behind the first. Number 23, terrapin soup. Diamondback terrapin was the single most prized ingredient in turn-of-the-century American fine dining, and no formal dinner in the Taft White House was complete without it. The turtles were harvested live from the Chesapeake Bay marshes, killed in the kitchen and simmered into a thick, dark soup enriched with sherry, cream, and egg yolks. The meat was dense, faintly gamey, and surrounded by fat that melted into the broth during hours of slow cooking. An entire terrapin served only 2 or 3 guests. At a presidential table seating dozens, the kitchen went through the animals by the crate. The dish was so central to elite Washington dining that when terrapin populations began collapsing from over-harvesting, the dining rooms of the Capitol treated it as a genuine crisis. Taft was among the last generation of presidents to eat it as a matter of routine. Number 22, fried oysters by the dozen. Raw oysters were everywhere in early 20th century America, sold on street corners and heaped on tavern bars. But the version that reached Taft's plate was something heavier. Whole oysters, shucked, dredged in breadcrumbs, and fried in lard until the coating turned golden and the inside stayed soft and briny. They arrived by the dozen. At formal dinners, oysters opened the meal. At private suppers, they could be the meal. The Chesapeake Bay alone produced staggering quantities every year, and oysters showed up at breakfast, lunch, and dinner without anyone raising an eyebrow. A plate of 12 was a starting point, not a limit. The grotesque part was not the oyster itself. It was how many a single man could put away in one sitting before the next course even arrived. Number 21, lobster Newburg. This dish was born in the dining room of Delmonico's restaurant in New York City, and quickly became a monument to Gilded Age excess. Chunks of fresh lobster meat were sautéed in butter, then buried in a sauce made of heavy cream, egg yolks, sherry, and still more butter. The result, was rich enough to make a person's stomach protest just reading the recipe. By Taft's presidency, lobster Newburg was standard at the most important tables in Washington. It appeared at White House functions as a matter of course, swimming in its golden sauce, served on porcelain to guests who were expected to finish every bite. For a man who never met a rich dish he could turn away from, it was exactly the kind of food that added weight by the month. Number 20. Calf's head soup. The head of a young calf, cleaned, split, and boiled until the meat fell from the bone. The brains were removed and set aside for another dish. What remained, the cheek meat, the tongue, the soft tissue around the eyes, and the cartilage, simmered for hours in its own broth until the liquid turned thick and gelatinous. Pieces of face meat floated in the finished bowl. By modern standards, the dish sounds like a dare. In Taft's era, it was considered refined. Calf's head soup appeared on White House menus alongside consomme and bisque, served in porcelain tureens and ladled out by staff as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The gelatin rendered from the skull gave the broth a body that no other ingredient could replicate, and Taft ate it at formal meals where the word grotesque would never have crossed anyone's mind. Number 19. The full presidential breakfast. The individual items on Taft's breakfast table were indulgent enough alone. Taken together, they formed something closer to a banquet than a morning routine. A typical breakfast for the president began with fruit, moved to a thick beefsteak with eggs, continued through several rounds of buttered toast with preserves, and often included fried potatoes or hominy on the side. Coffee arrived in quantity and was refilled without being asked. Some accounts from the era describe additional courses alongside the steak, making the morning meal a genuine multi-course event before the president even opened his first document of the day. This was not a state breakfast for visiting dignitaries. It was a Tuesday. The White House kitchen staff prepared this spread as daily routine, and the president worked through the entire table with the unhurried, methodical pace of a man who had been eating this way for as long as anyone could remember. What made it grotesque was not the steak. It was not the butter. It was not the eggs. It was the totality. A single man consuming an entire banquet before sunrise, clearing every plate and showing no sign of slowing down. The kitchen never scaled it back because no one told them to. By midday, Taft was hungry again. Lunch in the White House ran multiple courses of its own, and by the time the formal evening dinner began, the president had already eaten enough to sustain several ordinary people for a full day. 3 enormous meals every single day for 4 years. The sheer mechanical volume of food that passed through that kitchen for one man remains difficult to comprehend, even by the generous standards of Gilded Age presidential dining. Number 18. Sweetbreads. The thymus gland of a calf, blanched, pressed, and pan-fried in butter until the outside turned golden and the inside stayed soft and creamy. That was the dish called sweetbreads, and there was nothing sweet about them. They were not bread. They were an organ sliced from the throat of a young animal and cooked with enough butter and seasoning to make the origin almost forgettable. Almost. Sweetbreads had a delicate, faintly mineral flavor that wealthy diners of the era considered a mark of sophistication. Refusing them at a formal dinner would have been a social mistake. Taft never refused. The dish appeared alongside other organ preparations at White House meals that modern diners would struggle to recognize as food, and it was consumed without ceremony or comment. Number 17. Canvasback duck. No game bird carried more prestige in Taft's America than the canvasback. Hunters prized it because the bird fed on wild celery in the Chesapeake Bay, which gave the meat a flavor that no farm-raised duck could match. The birds were roasted quickly at high heat, served rare, and eaten in quantities that helped push the species towards serious decline. A proper canvasback dinner meant multiple birds per table, each carved in front of the guests and served with little more than their own drippings. The meat was dark, rich, and intensely flavored. Taft ate canvasback at formal Washington dinners where the bird was considered the centerpiece of the entire evening, the single course that everything else on the table existed to support. When it arrived, conversation paused. When it was carved, guests leaned forward. The canvasback was royalty on a plate, and Taft treated it accordingly. Number 16. Bone marrow on toast. The long leg bones of cattle were split lengthwise, roasted until the marrow inside turned soft and golden, and scooped onto toast with a narrow spoon. Bone marrow was one of the richest, most calorie-dense foods on any Gilded Age table. The texture was closer to warm butter than to meat, and it melted across the bread the moment it landed. A single serving delivered enough rendered animal fat to weigh down the stomach for hours. Taft's White House served it as part of multi-course dinners where richness was the point, not the problem. Each spread of marrow on toast was pure concentrated fat dressed up as a delicacy, and it was consumed without hesitation. The bones were passed down the table like bread, and nobody flinched. Number 15. Deviled kidneys. Lamb or veal kidneys, split open, rubbed with mustard and cayenne pepper, grilled quickly over high heat, and served on toast. The word deviled meant the sharp seasoning that cut through the dense, iron-rich flavor of the organ meat. Kidneys have a particular smell when they cook, sharp and unmistakable, and the taste follows the same line. It is something a person either acquires a taste for or does not. The political dining rooms of early 20th century Washington treated kidneys as routine. They appeared on menus alongside more familiar cuts without any special announcement. Taft ate them at breakfast alongside his beefsteak, two different organ meats on the same plate before the sun was fully up. The combination was not unusual for the era. What was unusual was how readily the president consumed it, day after day, without ever once pushing a plate away. Number 14. The White House State Dinner. A formal state dinner under Taft was not a meal. It was an endurance event. The evening began with raw oysters on ice, followed by a soup course, usually terrapin or a rich consomme, then a fish course, planked shad or poached salmon in cream sauce. After the fish, roasted meat carved at the table in front of the guests. Then a game course, canvasback duck or roasted quail, on its own plate with its own accompaniments. After the game, a salad, after the salad, cheese, after the cheese, dessert, sometimes 2 or 3 desserts layered in cream and sugar, accompanied by coffee and cordials. 8 courses, 9, sometimes 10. Each arrived with its own silverware, its own plate, and its own wine. Guests sat at the table for 3 hours or longer, eating without pause, watching the procession of dishes arrive and depart like acts in a play that would not end. For most of the people at that table, the challenge was simply getting through it. Stomachs protested by the 6th course. Waistcoats tightened. The final dessert was as much an act of politeness as appetite. For Taft, the opposite was true. He met every course with the same steady hunger, cleared plates that others left half-finished, and showed no strain by the time the coffee arrived. The state dinner was the main event of Washington's social life, a performance of national prestige and diplomatic hospitality, and Taft presided as both host and most enthusiastic participant. When the guests departed and the staff began clearing, the president's evening was not always over. The kitchen remained open, and Taft was known to keep eating well after the last guest had gone. Number 13. Calf's foot jelly. The front hooves of a young calf, boiled for hours until every bit of collagen dissolved into the water, then strained, sweetened with sugar and wine, and set in a mold to cool into a trembling, translucent block. Calf's foot jelly was considered a restorative, served to invalids and healthy diners alike, and it appeared on formal tables across Washington well into the early 20th century. The texture was somewhere between firm gelatin and soft rubber. The flavor was faintly meaty underneath the sweetness, a reminder that what wobbled on the plate had recently been attached to a living animal. The whole process took the better part of a day and produced a dish that most modern diners would not recognize as food. But at a White House dinner in the Taft years, a gleaming mold of calf's foot jelly on the sideboard signaled that nothing had been spared. Number 12. Stewed squirrel. A whole squirrel, skinned, cleaned, and simmered low in a covered pot with onions, root vegetables, and a splash of vinegar until the small bones loosened and the lean, dark meat turned tender. Squirrel was common game across the eastern United States and showed up on tables from frontier cabins to formal dining rooms without apology. The meat was dense, darker than chicken, with a faintly nutty flavor that came from the animal's diet of acorns and hickory nuts. A single squirrel did not go far, so a proper stew often required several. Taft grew up in Cincinnati, where wild game was still part of the regional table in the late 19th century, and dishes like stewed squirrel carried no stigma at all. What seems grotesque now was simply supper then. The bones were small, the portions modest, and you ate around them with your fingers when the fork gave up. Number 11. Head cheese. Despite the name, head cheese contains no cheese. It is the meat from the head of a pig or calf, boiled until it falls from the skull, then chopped, seasoned, and pressed into a mold where the natural gelatin sets it into a solid loaf. Sliced thin, the cross-section shows speckled bits of ear, cheek, snout, and whatever else came loose during the boil. Head cheese was common on American tables throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was practical. It used every scrap of an animal that would otherwise go to waste. Taft ate in an era where head cheese required no explanation and no apology. It was simply food. The grotesque part is entirely modern. A discomfort with knowing exactly which parts of the face are sitting in the slice on your plate. Number 10. Tripe, the stomach lining of a cow cleaned, bleached, and cooked until tender. Tripe had a honeycomb texture, a faint barnyard smell, and almost no flavor on its own, which meant the cooking method carried the entire dish. In Taft's era, it was stewed with onions and milk into a thick white soup or fried with butter and served alongside toast. Philadelphia pepper pot, one of the most famous American soups of the 19th century, was built on tripe. The dish appeared on menus from street vendors to formal dining rooms without any distinction between the two. Taft grew up eating tripe in an era when organ meats were standard fare, not curiosities. The texture was soft, slightly chewy, and unmistakably animal in a way that no other cut of meat quite replicated. Number 9. Potted pigeon. A whole pigeon, roasted until just done, then packed tightly into a ceramic pot and sealed under a thick layer of melted butter that hardened into a white cap as it cooled. The butter kept the air out and the meat preserved for days or even weeks. Potted pigeon was a fixture of American formal entertaining in the Gilded Age and into the early 20th century, passed down from English country house traditions. The bird was eaten cold, pulled apart with fingers or a small fork, the butter scraped aside to reveal dark, concentrated meat pressed against bone. There was no disguising what was inside. You opened the pot and saw a compressed bird, legs folded, breastbone visible through the dense meat. The flavor was rich and intensely gamey, nothing like the mild poultry modern diners expect. For a man of Taft's appetite, a pot of pigeon was a side course, not a centerpiece. Number 8. Chitterlings. The small intestines of a pig, cleaned meticulously by hand, soaked in salt water for hours, and then boiled or stewed until tender. The smell during cooking was powerful enough to clear a house. Chitterlings were eaten across the American South and Midwest, crossing lines of race and class in ways that few other dishes did. The texture when done was soft, slightly chewy, with a slippery quality that no other cut of pork shared. The flavor was mild once the cleaning was thorough, But the knowledge of what you were eating never entirely left the table. In early 20th century Washington, chitterlings appeared at informal gatherings and regional dinners where the host wanted to signal abundance by using every part of the animal. Taft, raised in a city where German and Southern food traditions overlapped freely, would not have blinked at a plate of them. The rest of the country, then and now, had stronger opinions. Number 7. The Presidential Diet. In 1905, 4 years before he became president, William Howard Taft began exchanging letters with a British physician named Nathaniel York Davies, a specialist in weight reduction who treated prominent clients by mail. Taft wanted to lose weight. He understood he was too heavy, and the letters that survive from their correspondence reveal something that is almost comic if it were not so telling. York Davies prescribed a strict regimen: lean meats in small portions, vegetables without butter, no bread at dinner, no pastries, no second helpings. Taft tried. He genuinely tried. But the letters show a man fighting a battle he could not win. He reported his meals honestly, and even his reduced intake would have been generous by any ordinary standard. A light breakfast still included meat and eggs. A restrained dinner still ran multiple courses. The doctor urged him to cut back further. Taft responded with explanations, promises, and the steady erosion of every boundary the diet tried to set. When social obligations demanded a formal meal, the plan collapsed. When political travel put him at banquet tables across the country, no version of restraint could survive the occasion. The correspondence continued for years, through his presidency and beyond, painting a portrait of a man who understood exactly what the food was doing to his body and could not stop himself from eating it. He lost weight. He gained it back. He lost it again. The cycle became its own kind of grotesque, not any single dish, but the inability to push away from the table. By the time Taft left the White House in 1913, the diet had failed more often than it had succeeded, and his weight remained stubbornly above 300 pounds. Number 6. Calf brains. The brain of a young calf, removed from the skull, soaked in cold water to firm the tissue, and then gently poached or fried in butter. The finished dish arrived on the plate looking unmistakably like what it was: a pale, soft, convoluted organ with no way to disguise its origin. Calf brains were a delicacy in Taft's era, prized for their creamy texture and mild, almost neutral flavor that absorbed whatever sauce surrounded them. They were scrambled with eggs at breakfast, fried as croquettes at luncheons, and presented in cream sauce at formal dinners. The dish required a steady nerve from anyone who looked too closely at their plate. But in the dining rooms where Taft ate, looking closely at the food was not the point. Eating it was. Brains were food, the same as tongue, the same as liver, the same as every other part of the animal that the Gilded Age kitchen extracted and served without apology. Number 5. Whole roasted woodcock. The woodcock was a small game bird that was roasted and served whole, including its head, beak, and in many traditional preparations, its intestines. The bird was not gutted before cooking. The trail, as the innards were called, was considered the finest part, and diners were expected to eat around or through them without complaint. The head was left attached and sometimes used as a handle or pushed through the body as a skewer. A single woodcock was barely larger than a man's fist, which meant eating one required getting intimate with every part of the animal at close range. At presidential game dinners, woodcock arrived as its own course, each guest receiving a whole bird to navigate. For Taft, it was one more creature consumed entirely and without hesitation. Number 4. Mincemeat pie. Not the mild, fruit-heavy version sold in grocery stores today, but the original. Real mincemeat contained finely chopped beef or venison, beef kidney fat, dried fruits, sugar, spices, and a generous pour of brandy or rum, all packed into a pastry crust and baked until the filling turned dark, dense, and fragrant. The combination of meat and sweetness in the same bite was the whole point, a holdover from centuries of English cooking where the line between savory and dessert did not exist. The fat rendered into the fruit and the brandy soaked into everything, producing a slice that sat in the stomach like a stone. A full pie weighed several pounds. At holiday tables during the Taft era, mincemeat pie closed a meal that had already run through multiple courses of roasted meat, cream sauces, and heavy starches. It was a final, calorie-laden exclamation point at the end of an evening that had been nothing but exclamation points from the start. Number 3. Pig jowl. The cheek of a pig, cured, smoked, and either sliced thin for frying or braised whole until the meat collapsed into softness and the fat rendered to silk. Pig jowl carried an intense, porky flavor stronger and fattier than bacon, and it was used across American cooking in the early 20th century as both a main dish and a seasoning. A thick slab of fried jowl served alongside eggs and grits was breakfast food across much of the South and Midwest. The cut came from the face of the animal, which left nothing to the imagination about its origin. The fat content was extreme, richer and heavier than belly bacon, and the dish announced with every bite exactly what part of the pig was on the plate. Nobody eating pig jowl in Taft's America could pretend it came from anywhere polite. Number 2. Scrapple. Every part of the pig that could not be sold as a recognizable cut, the head, the organs, the trim, the scraps, was boiled together in a single pot until the meat fell apart. The resulting mush was mixed with cornmeal and spices, poured into loaf pans, and chilled until solid. In the morning, it was sliced and fried in lard until the outside crisped and the inside stayed soft and vaguely meaty. Scrapple was a Pennsylvania Dutch invention that spread across the mid-Atlantic, and it was a fixture of the region where Taft spent much of his political life. The ingredient list read like an inventory of everything polite company preferred not to discuss. Liver, heart, tongue, skin, and whatever the butcher could not sell went into the pot. The name itself was an admission: scraps. Taft ate it as part of the unspoken American political tradition of consuming whatever the region put in front of him. In Pennsylvania, what they put in front of him was made from every last piece of the pig. Number 1. Roasted possum. In January of 1909, just weeks before his inauguration, William Howard Taft attended a banquet in Atlanta, Georgia, where the centerpiece of the meal was a whole roasted possum. The animal was prepared in the Southern tradition, slow roasted with sweet potatoes arranged around the body and served on a platter with the tail still attached. Taft ate it, and the event made national headlines. Overnight, the possum became a symbol of the incoming president. Toy manufacturers rushed to produce stuffed possum dolls called Billy Possum, hoping to create a sensation to rival Theodore Roosevelt's teddy bear. The Billy Possum failed completely. The American public had no interest in cuddling a marsupial, but the image stuck. A man weighing well over 300 pounds, sitting down at a formal banquet in his honor, eating a roasted scavenger off a silver platter while the whole country looked on. The animal itself was gray-furred, sharp-toothed, with a naked tail and a face most Americans associated with garbage cans and back alleys, not dinner plates. And yet, there it sat, on a white tablecloth, surrounded by fine china, served to the man about to become president. Of every food William Howard Taft consumed in his long career of consuming, the possum was the one the country remembered, not because it was the richest, the rarest, or the most excessive, because it was the most honest. A man who ate everything, sitting down to eat the one animal that ate everything too. That was the possum dinner, and that was William Howard Taft. The count is finished. 25 foods, every one of them real, consumed by a man who became the heaviest president in American history and spent decades trying and failing to push himself away from the table. After leaving the White House, Taft lost a significant amount of weight and went on to serve as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only person in American history to hold both offices. The man who could not stop eating eventually found a way to slow down, but the tureens, the platters, the roasted possum on the tablecloth, those belonged to a version of him that the country never forgot. If one of these foods made your stomach turn, drop it in the comments. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time.